Kevin, we appreciate that. A Fox News alert, new details on the latest deadly terror attack in Paris. Investigators trying to determine if the gunman who was killed after fatally shooting a police officer had accomplices. A note praising the Islamic State was found near his body. We also know he was questioned in February, but released for lack of evidence, and that he has a long criminal record, although the French authorities say it didn't necessarily point to extremism. Here at home, the president tweeting, quote, another terrorist attack in Paris. The people of France will not take much more of this. Will have a big effect on the presidential election. Of course, that election is scheduled for Sunday. The French capital is now on high alert ahead of the voting. ISIS quickly claimed responsibility for this deadly shooting, which injured an officer as well as a tourist. And the 37-year-old officer you see here was killed. Police returned fire, killing the gunman. Joining me now for more on this, Thomas Joscelyn, Senior Fellow for the Defense of Democracies and Senior Editor for the Long War Journal. So let's talk a little bit about the claim by ISIS, because that's something I know you look at very closely. It's not always consistent among different attacks. What do you make of the claim, how quickly it came, and where it came from?
Well, this one came out very quickly. I mean, sometimes it can take till the next day or even days for them to claim an attack. They put this claim out within hours, and they identified the terrorist by his nom de guerre. Now, the big open question right now is, separately, French press reports and the French government have identified another individual who was imprisoned for 15 years or so as the actual main guy who did this. And there's some concerns about whether or not he was ever actually in Belgium or not. The reason why that comes up is because the nom de guerre that was used by a mock news agency, which is the ISIS main propaganda channel, indicated that he had been from Belgium or had lived in Belgium, and yet there's no indication that I see so far that the guy who actually did this had ever been to Belgium or was living there. So it's very confusing at this point whether or not the claim that Amok and ICE put out is matching the guy who actually did this. Why is that important? Well, it's important to figure out what their actual organization is. Now, in terms of the end violence, okay, a lot of times it doesn't matter from the victim's perspective if it's organized or not in terms of actually, you know, who the tragedy here. But the problem really overall is that ISIS still has an organization that's trying to orchestrate these attacks in Europe and elsewhere. And if this was one of these so-called remote controlled attacks where you have somebody on the other end of the line in Iraq or Syria who's directing this guy and getting him to do this, well, that's important to know, because that means that you still have ISIS operatives in the game who haven't been stopped from directing this sort of thing. And you say it's a commonly held myth that ISIS just claims responsibility for all sorts of attacks. Why is that a myth out there? You know, because people don't track this very closely, so they think that ISIS claims anything under the sun. Not true. There were bombings in Chelsea right near here by a guy who referenced ISIS in his diary and was making a reference to the fact that he needed to attack here at home because that's what ISIS called for. ISIS never claimed that attack. In the last couple of weeks, there was an attack in Stockholm, Sweden, not claimed by ISIS, even though there are indications that the individual who did it may have been tied to ISIS. There was a bombing in Germany just recently, not claimed by ISIS. So they do claim some attacks, other ones they don't. And we find that more often than not, when they do claim something, there's some sort of tie. Either they're inspired, directed, remote controlled, or have some sort of ties to the ISIS network. You look back on France and what's happened there over the last several months. Just a few weeks ago at the Orly airport, there was a man, a terrorist there, trying to attack a police officer. The month before that, in February, you had a man attack police officers, the soldiers outside the Louvre. It's very frequent every few weeks, and there's been different theories as to why that is. Is it frequent, number one, Tom? Is this a new reality? Why are we seeing what seems to be a new terror attack in Europe every few weeks? Well, because we are. I mean, there have been 4 attacks since March. 2 of them have been claimed by ISIS, one in London, of course, and then two others I previously mentioned. The bottom line here is that the European security services, counterterrorism and intelligence, are shutting down just an untold number of plots. Basically, you have plots being disrupted because of surveillance. You have plots being disrupted because of specific intelligence, arrests, that sort of thing. I think that is sort of not really properly understood here. The threat is much greater than actually the guys who get through, like we saw yesterday. Unfortunately, you have dozens of plots that have been shut down in the UK, France, Germany, Belgium, and elsewhere. I'm thinking about those plots, one of which was thwarted a few days ago in France, and I'm imagining quicksand, someone trying to get out of quicksand and keep falling behind, because we keep on seeing some of these attacks come through. How do we get ahead of it, Tom? Is there a way to get to the point where you're not playing catch-up, it seems, in some circumstances where these guys get through and do damage? My big concern in all this is that we're not going to deliver them a sound military defeat that discredits the ideology and the message they've been pumping out for years. So you still think a good old-fashioned, pardon the description, that's right, that's what we need? That's what they need, yeah. It needs to be clear to the population that they do not represent the future and that their vision of the world is not acceptable. And it needs to be something that's communicated. If you think back to the wars of the past, there's always been some sort of clear line of demarcation between the war machine that was being, sort of let loose on the world and the end of that. And you've heard people say, well, this is a war that won't end on an aircraft carrier with signing a peace treaty or something along those lines. That's probably right, but there still needs to be a sound defeat. And my problem right now is, look at a map. Where are we defeating the jihadis sort of wholesale? I'd say nowhere. Yes, ISIS is losing territory in Iraq and Syria. Absolutely, it's important to keep in mind. But you have multiple other problems, including Al-Qaeda in Syria, and ISIS is going to continue to thrive as an insurgency even after they lose more ground. So the bottom line is the ideology being discredited? I would say globally, no. Is there a sound military defeat on its way? Right now, it doesn't look like it.
And so you basically say that we need to go after them in those particular hot spots, deliver a sound defeat, and show it doesn't pay to be part of any of these organizations.
It needs to be a clear message that you're not going to survive and get away with this in the long run.
Why aren't we doing that?
I think it's a lack of political will. I mean, what does this all really come down to? It all comes down to basically, look, for the last decade or so, most of this war has been fought by flying drones and airstrikes and that sort of thing. There's not a willingness to use a lot of American ground forces. I get it. I don't really want to call for American soldiers to go into Syria or more to go into Iraq or in Syria, Afghanistan, elsewhere. I understand that. However, I just don't see how this is going to end unless we start thinking about how to actually achieve something that looks like victory. I don't believe that when you hear people say we can't win this war, we can't have some sort of real victory. I don't believe that. I think every other foe in the past has been vanquished. I think this foe is certainly one that can be vanquished. They don't have a Nazi-style war machine. They're not as threatening as the Soviet Union. This is a foe that can be beaten. I just don't think at this point we're even thinking along those lines.
Great perspective for us always, Tom. Thank you very much.
Thank you.